Thank you so much for coming to this. So welcome. This is an event put on by the Center for California Studies. We can thank them for all the food and the organization of this thing. Today we have me presenting. I'm the director of the Project and Informed Electorate and professor in the political science department, and also the director of the Cal Speaks poll. So this is a poll that we're reporting on. We also have Dr. Kristina Flores-Victor here, an assistant professor in political science. She got her PhD at UC Davis, and her work focuses on American politics, California politics, immigration, and Latinx politics. And recently, she's doing work on changing perceptions of discrimination within Latinx communities and how voters use ethnic and policy cues to make decisions. So very relevant stuff. And Dr. Ambar Gonzalez is a professor in the Child and Adolescent Development Program here, and she got her PhD in education with an emphasis on child and adolescent development from the University of California, Santa Barbara. And her research focuses on examining the influence of social support networks and institutional structures on Latinx students, college student identity development, and education and career aspirations and motivations. So also very relevant. So we have an expert on the Latino politics side and also on the education side. So what we'll do today is we will go through and show you some slides that are poll results and make some commentary on what they sort of mean. And then if you have questions or comments, go ahead and raise your hand. We're going to be sort of casual about it today. It is being recorded, so I'll try to get a microphone to you if you want to make a comment. But that's the way it'll work today. So thank you for speaking about your comments and throwing in when you need to. So this survey was funded by a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and it's part of a coalition of folks from UC Berkeley, UCLA, and here at Sacramento State. So that's the list of the names up there at the top. The survey was fielded in August of 2022, so these are not like fresh off the press sort of numbers, so don't worry about the last year, I guess. And we administered this call of a polling organization here on campus called Cal Speaks that is housed in the Institute for Social Research. And we have a statewide survey panel. So it's administered online, and it's a statewide representative panel of Californians. It is not registered voters. Some statewide polls are registered voters only. This one is everybody. We want to hear what all Californians think, not just those who are going to vote. We got 1,119 respondents to this poll, and the margin of error is plus or minus 2.9%. So if you're not super familiar with that, that just means any percentage that you see, we're confident, 95% confident, that the real number is within 3 points plus or minus whatever we're reporting, just statistically. Okay. So first of all, we had some questions on knowledge and preferences. So people were asked to say if it's true or false, and this one is, California public colleges and universities are legally required to give admission advantages to students of color when they apply to attend. That's not true. We passed a Proposition 209 back in 1996, so it hasn't been the case for a whole generation. 38% of Californians got that wrong, so they believed that it was legally required, even though it's not. And so these ones are kind of interesting, a little bit surprising, I think. Young people were more likely to get that right. I guess that makes sense because they're more likely to be applying to college or just having been in college. But the people in that middle age group would have been in that position around the time of Prop 209, so you would think maybe they would remember it. But it's sort of, the knowledge level decreases with age. And then in terms of ideology, liberals were more accurate than the other moderate or conservative groups. I should say that I am highlighting the things that were statistically significant for different demographic groups, so I'm not going to present every demographic group, just the ones that kind of jumped out. And so in this case, it was age and ideology that jumped out. All right, what commentary do you have about this one?
I just had one comment about this one is I think sometimes even though we're asking them a question about California, there's a national discourse about affirmative action, and there have been cases that have gone to the Supreme Court in other states. And so people might not kind of get the distinction of the national discussion around affirmative action and what's required within states and the difference between maybe private universities and public universities. So to me, some of this might be a little confusion on the topic and not kind of a malicious intent of not understanding, but the national discussion kind of confusing the state discussion.
And I should note that this poll was well before the Supreme Court decision on this topic, which was like a year later. All right, do you favor or oppose affirmative action programs designed to increase the number of minority students in California public college and university campuses? So the last one was asking, do we do this already? And this one is asking, would you prefer that we do this, basically? And it turns out that most Californians do support it, and many of them strongly. Hispanic or Latinos support it more strongly than everyone else lumped together. I should say another proviso. In this poll, as they do in the census and other places, Latino identity is separate from race. So race is a separate category. So you could be Black and Latino, right? You could be white and Latino. And so that's why they're separated out. But it also means that when we come to race, there's not a category for Latino. So just so you know that that's what's going on. And then this is that same question, and you can see the race breakdown. You can see that whites are really mixed on it, kind of all across the board. African Americans are very favorable. Asian American Pacific Islanders are also fairly mixed. And then people in the other category, and I would note again that the other category is probably a lot of Hispanics because that's what California has, right? Another thing I would want to note is that all these figures are weighted for population parameters. So after we do the survey, we apply weights to make it match the population. In case we didn't get as many people in different categories in the survey, we make mathematic adjustments afterwards. All right, so those who did know that Prop 209 passed, essentially, that we don't give those preferences in California, were more likely to favor the affirmative action in higher ed. So it's those last two questions we looked at kind of together. And so that's kind of interesting to me that the people who know about it also would prefer to have it. Any points on that?
I just want to make a quick point on the slide previous. There's a really interesting variation for the AAPI group. And I think I just want to point out, because it's going to come up on other slides too, that the AAPI group is a very diverse group, kind of like this pan-ethnic Latino group. There are many groups within it. And so if you look at previous surveys, there's a huge difference between maybe what people who would self-identify as Chinese American versus Filipino American versus Korean. And so in general, Filipinos are much more supportive of affirmative action programs than say Chinese Americans. So sometimes when you look at the bar graph for the AAPI and you see that it's so variable, it's because the group itself is very diverse and very variable. And so you're going to see that theme as we go through other slides. So I just want you to look for that when we go.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Yeah, we did years ago. I was part of a survey that was focused specifically on Asian Americans, and we found huge differences between especially more recent immigrant groups like Cambodian and Vietnamese, and those who have been here longer, for the most part, like Chinese and Japanese and so forth. Very different politically. So that's an excellent point. And then, of course, on this slide, I forgot to actually say this. I think that Republicans are more opposed. I'm sure that's not surprising. But on the left, we have Republicans. A majority of them are opposed to the idea of these affirmative action programs, whereas Democrats are more in favor, and as are the other groups. But it's pretty mixed in that case. Did you have something?
Can you hear me? Hi, Amber Gonzalez. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I think one thing that also struck me was the why question. So I hope that as we're going through these quantitative results, we also are asking ourselves, why? Why are Latino students more supportive of affirmative action? Why do we see that Black students are? And it might also have something to do with the underrepresentation on campus. So the reality of our daily lives that we don't see ourselves on campus, and would these policies create more opportunities for us to see ourselves on campus. A lot of times students see ourselves in the MLK Center, but I then wouldn't see myself in the classroom in the science building, right? Or I don't see faculty that look like me. And so if I'm not seeing that, maybe these policies might be able to change that.
Excellent. Okay, so we actually had an open-ended question asking follow-up to that last one, why? So we actually asked the why question. Here are some quotes from detractors, people who are opposed to it. So I tried to get some that were, so there are like 1,100 of them to look through, right? So obviously everything's not represented, but I tried to get some that represented the main themes. So why do more for, and some of them have grammatical errors, of course. Why do more for minority? They get lots now. There were plenty that had something along those lines. Lots that says something like admission should go on merit regardless of race. And then there were a few that were kind of mean, like promotes mediocrity and entitled crybabies. So I just wanted that represented here, that people have that range. Another one, invest money into early childhood education, training and opportunities. Don't wait to invest until college. Do it while they're young. And then the supporters said things like diversity strengthens teams, education is the key for minorities to contribute to society and make America a better place. It mitigates the consequences of systemic and social discrimination and benefits all students in developing empathy and tolerance and exposure to novel ideas. So a whole bunch of points of view, many of them, I was actually really interested to see how thoughtful the responses are. They're responding online. Some of them are on their phones. So, I was going to say it takes longer to respond on your phone, but you guys probably don't think so because you're faster on your phones. But the old people had a harder time doing that, but they still gave long responses. And then there were quite a few actually that were kind of ambivalent. So I have mixed feelings about this. I'm neutral. I don't know if they help or not. And then some like the last one, we should do other things probably to make people compete on the same level. And so I'm not really sure about this. So it's kind of interesting, the range, and there are many more. All right, another knowledge question. We asked people if the mix of racial and ethnic backgrounds in California's public K-12 teachers closely matches that of students. And it turns out that is false. So if you look at Department of Ed stats, 23% of students are non-Hispanic white, but 63% of teachers are. So huge imbalance there. 54% of students are Hispanic, but only 20% of teachers are. So it's not even really close. So white and Asian respondents were more accurate on this, realizing that there's not a match between students and teachers. And Latinos were less accurate on this. So those two sort of surprised me. And then higher income were more accurate, but that's not surprising. It correlates with education and so forth. So what do you folks think about that one?
On these questions, I was so curious, and maybe you're all curious too, but whether people are thinking about California as a whole or their own home school district. And my guess is that people are drawing from their own experiences of where their children go to school and maybe the district that they went to. And so I kind of be curious for us to take the results from this question and then look and see where Hispanic or Latino teachers are teaching. And so potentially maybe their school or their district was a little bit more diverse because that's where the teachers are wanting to be placed and wanting to work. That would be my best estimate for looking at this question right now.
We do have county level data, so we could kind of do that. Yeah, that was my guess too. It's just a reflection of what they see, and then with the more educated, maybe they've read about it and have this sort of higher level knowledge. We asked another question that's related to this. Teachers tend to relate more to students whom they share racial and ethnic backgrounds. So basically, it doesn't matter that there's not a match between teachers and students. And there were tons of people in the neutral category who just weren't sure. They maybe hadn't thought about it or whatever, equal to the number who actually agreed that it matters. And then the groups that were more likely to even express some sort of opinion, but also agree, were the more educated liberals and Democrats. So that's probably not super surprising. And then when we put those two together, so the knowledge question and then the, it doesn't matter question, it's very mixed. So does the match matter? People who knew that there is a mismatch, 20% of them, or 20% of the correct were in the match matters category. The match doesn't matter, 47% of the people who are correct. So, it's both ends, right? We have more on both sides of that it matters and it doesn't matter. But there are a lot in the middle. And I suspect that's just people who don't know, right? Like in the last slide, we saw a lot of people hadn't thought about it and don't really know. But understanding that it's the case and caring about it are sort of two separate things.
I have a comment here that I'm wondering if the people in the neutral category is that if we'd asked, and this may be for students who are thinking about research, like things to research if you're interested in grad school too, is thinking about, do people think it matters more in terms of things like for language acquisition, language courses, students' introduction in pre-K or like early childhood education programs. And then my guess is that people also, when it comes to certain fields, I feel like, and even I've heard this on this campus, right? Math is math, right? We don't need like cultural diversity in STEM or in certain fields because it's just facts. And so there's not overlap there. I don't agree with that. I'm just saying that I heard that. So my guess is maybe if we ask them more specifically about certain subjects, that they might say that like cultural and ethnic and language congruency is important. But like overall as a whole, they're like, I don't know. Is it important? Is it not important? Is it just good to have good teachers? That was kind of what I thought when I saw some of these results.
I also thought that this might be an uncomfortable question, right? So I think there's also discomfort in sometimes saying, no, I don't agree with that. There could just be discomfort in saying, like, as an individual, I'm uncomfortable saying I disagree with that. So this could also be measuring somebody's comfort level with their own answer to this question.
All right, here's some beliefs on and questions about people's experience on these topics. So race no longer matters in the United States, just an overall kind of question. And 77% think race still matters, but 11% think it doesn't. The big group that stood out that thinks it doesn't matter is Republicans. Democrats very much think it matters, and people who are, independents or other parties very much also think it matters. Probably not surprising. And this one is, I have to explain this one a bit, but we asked, in getting ahead, has your race and or ethnicity ever helped you, hurt you, or has your race and ethnicity not been much of a factor? So if you look at the top gray here, that's people who said it doesn't, it's not much of a factor. So you can see that white people are like, oh, it didn't make a difference. It didn't help me. It didn't make a difference, right? And people, African-Americans, very few of them thought that, and a few more AAPI and more in the other category, which again is Latinos are going to be in this category. And then it hurt is the ones that are, the percentages are in red. Hurt, this was more extreme hurt very much, hurt, somewhat. So you can see that African-Americans especially feel like it's hurt them. But AAPI respondents did as well. And then the other category, a lot of them did also. White people thought that their race helped. A fair number of them admit that, but some thought it hurt, right? So we have, 8% saying it hurt a lot, 15% it hurt somewhat. Or hurt a little is actually the way we phrased it. So any commentary on this one? There's nothing super surprising probably here, except that maybe with the white one, we'll get more into that in a second. In your view, how much discrimination do the following groups of Californians face? And this is K through 12. So we asked a series in K through 12, and then also a series about higher ed. So most Californians think that Latinos experience discrimination in K through 12 schools. More of them think it's moderate, not a great deal of discrimination, but a majority of Californians think they do. And the groups that are more likely to think that are women, people with more education, Democrats, liberals, and also African Americans. Probably the patterns we would expect, right? Pipe up if you want to make any comments. And then the same question, but for Blacks, and most Californians also think that they experience discrimination, actually a little bit more. If you see the great deals is very high. And the groups that think that are women, Democrats, liberals, and Asian and Pacific Islanders. So if I didn't mention a group, it means that it wasn't statistically significant in that group. And then AAPI, most people don't think that they experience a great deal of discrimination in K through 12. But some people, or many people, almost half think it's moderate, but almost half again also think it's none. So very different picture than the other two groups we looked at, and the ones who think that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders get that discrimination, women, Democrats, and then the members of the group themselves. And then for whites, people don't think whites face discrimination for the most part, but the people who are more likely to think they do are white people. 21% of white people thought that white people face discrimination in K through 12. People with less education, like who didn't go to college, are more likely to think that. Republicans and conservatives as well. So in political science, we divide out ideology and partisanship. They overlap pretty closely, but they're not exactly the same thing. And we don't see exactly the same results by ideology and partisanship. All right, so this is the same sorts of questions, but this is higher ed. So a majority also think that Latinos experience discrimination in higher ed, but most think it's moderate, 56%, and 30% think it's none. And the people who think that it is bad are Latinos, women, and Democrats. It's very different by party. 83% of Democrats think so versus 41% of Republicans. Any comments on that?
Well, not this slide particularly, but I was thinking about the other slides too. You see a lot of racial and ethnic solidarity in groups thinking that other groups experience discrimination, and where that kind of falls off was for the AAPI group. And so I think that's something for us to also keep our eye on as the other slides come up forward, and potentially where, certain things like model minority and stuff come back to kind of hurt the community. So just to keep an eye on when you see cross-racial and ethnic solidarity in understanding others' experiences and perceptions, and then when you don't see it. So it's harder to see when you don't see it because it doesn't appear as a little bullet point, but just kind of keep that in mind as we go through some of these slides. I think it stood out to me.
Yeah, and so for the same thing for higher education for Black, most Californians think that they do experience discrimination, and 27% think it's a great deal. But 26% think they don't. And the groups that think that they do are people in lower income households. So income hasn't come into this, and that's because it wasn't significant in the other categories. But in this case, it was. Latinos, Blacks, and the other race, remember that's, again, Hispanics in that group. And then by party, again, there's a big difference. Democrats, 66% versus 40% of Republicans, and then liberals. Yeah. Yes. And then for AAPI, most people don't think it's a great deal, but almost half of Californians thought it's a moderate amount, but almost half of Californians also say none. And that probably is the point about disaggregation. I think it is a very important one here. Because, if you think about Chinese, Japanese, Korean, groups that have been around longer, it's very different from the more recent immigrant groups. So it probably depends on what people have in their mind. And then for whites, 81% think no, there's no discrimination. 16% think it's moderate. 3% think that's a great deal of discrimination against white people in higher ed. But white people are, of course, the ones that are more likely to think that, 22% of them. Asian Americans more likely to think that too. And then it's also a differential by party, 30% of Republicans versus 15% of Democrats. Conservatives, and then those with less education think whites have a hard time. I'm holding back comments that I want to make. Anyway, so then we also asked some things about the playing field. So this idea that students from any school can do well if they work hard enough, right? The sort of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, American dream kind of thing. And 47% did say that they agreed with that, that you can, if you work hard enough, it doesn't matter which school you went to for K through 12, you're going to be fine. But the less educated were more likely to agree with that anybody can do it, essentially, and conservatives were more likely to agree with that. Any ideas about what that means? I was kind of surprised by the education one.
I think it's a bit of, might be too philosophical, but in the US, we very much value individualistic explanations for things. So when we go to blame people we tend to blame individuals and not systems. So I think a little of this might just be reflected in kind of our collective philosophy about life is that, and if you're talking about less educated individuals, they might be saying, oh, I could have studied harder in school, or if I had gotten better grades, maybe I would have gone to college. So it might be just a kind of a very norm in the United States to have individual explanations for why things happen. And especially for the group that didn't go, and they're thinking kind of like, oh, this was probably my fault why I didn't go.
Yeah. And the more educated are more likely to have been exposed to the idea of systemic racism. So that probably explains a lot of that, honestly. Okay, so some attitudes about diversity. So we asked a series of questions that have something to do with, beliefs about diversity and how much we value. Being able to speak more than one language is a valuable asset. Almost everybody agreed with that. It's important for children in California to grow up knowing about the history and cultures of the major racial and ethnic groups in the states. So that sort of argument for ethnic studies sort of courses, that's been, in the news lately. 80% agree, so pretty high on that one. And these don't always add up because of rounding error or did not answer. And then it would be better if California had more diverse neighborhoods. We had, that one's much more mixed. 54% agree, 32% neutral, and 14% disagree. So, Yeah. So then we also asked some questions about inequality between schools in K through 12. Not all public K through 12 schools in California provide the basic education that our students need. So this idea that we do have some schools that aren't really delivering what we need, 71% agreed with that, and only 11% disagreed. Some California public school K through 12 school systems have more effective and experienced teachers than others. Even more people agreed with that. This idea that we don't have the highest level of teachers in every single school. And then we asked a series of priority questions for policies that people would prefer for K through 12 and also higher ed, but this is the K through 12. And I should say that these are ordered. You go top and down and then over here and down. So the most who think it's essential is this category, and then the least is this category. So we had finding effective and committed teachers for high poverty schools. Many Californians thought that was essential or a higher priority. Ensuring that young people learn to interact and work with youth of other races. Folks really agreed with that one as well. Spending extra on schools with many students from groups that have faced discrimination so they can catch up. There's a fair amount of agreement with that one, and on that one in particular, the higher income people were more likely to disagree with this one, right? Because they're thinking about the money part, I guess, because it specifies spending more money. So that was kind of interesting. The lower income people were more likely to think it's a priority. Developing student ability in more than one language. Folks mostly agreed with that, but it wasn't as strong as the other three we looked at. Finding ways to get more teachers from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds to match the student body. That was deemed essential by almost a third or close to it. So most people agree with that, but 11% thought it was not a priority at all. And then getting back to basics in K through 12 schools, a quit focusing on diversity and inclusion. That one's more mixed. So not a priority is a quarter, but essential is also a quarter. And then the middle category sort of, which tends to be people who kind of don't know, they pick the middle, is also 25%. So mixed ideas on what about this DEI stuff? Is it too much kind of question? Very mixed. Oh, and the support for that one increases by age. So older people think we should quit with this DEI stuff, basically. And younger people think it's a good idea. Probably not surprising. Comments on any of those?
Just very much related to the slides that you have.
Yeah.
Very much related to the slides that you had before.
Yeah, it all kind of
relationship.
right. And then the same sorts of questions, but for higher ed. And this one was, if you're deciding how to spend California tax dollars, what priority would solving these problems be to you? Students can't get enough financial aid to pay for public higher ed. 43% thought that would be an essential priority. Most people thought it was, very high in their priority list. Some students struggle or drop out of college because they don't enter with college level skills. That one hit a nerve with a lot of people too, just kind of interesting. Black and Latino Californians are much less likely to have college degrees than whites and Asians, which is factually the case. Most people agreed with that, but less than the other two. And unsurprisingly, Black and Latino respondents thought it was more important than the AAPI and white respondents. So it's, that's whoever's specifically called out in the question, basically. Not enough Californians have access to public higher ed. That one is a little bit more mixed. It's still, people prioritize it, but not as much as the other three we've looked at. And Black and Latino respondents gave it a higher priority than others, than AAPI and white. And then go ahead, did you have something? Okay, students start college but don't finish their degree. That one was not as much of a priority to any of the groups, but it's still a priority. There were very few that were saying, like, not a big deal. Did you have something?
So these two slides were fascinating to me because when policies are presented in a frame that emphasizes the low income or the cost to all, there's higher support. As soon as we mention a particular group, or we say like disadvantaged groups or groups that are left out, then the support starts to fragment. So it's just really interesting that if extra education is like, hey, we need to bring all schools up to a level, people are like, yes. And we're like, college is expensive, we should get more money. They're like, yes. And if we're like, hey, certain groups have been left out, they're like,
yeah,
maybe. I mean, they're not against it, but they're not as enthusiastic, right? So these two slides, I think, illustrate that really well, is the low income kind of frame or money and cost frame versus the specific groups might need extra frame don't seem to have the same kind of level of support, which is fascinating from a political perspective of how to frame potentially policy change or policy issues.
Exactly. So I didn't put this by each one of them, but there were huge differences between Republicans and conservatives and Democrats and liberals, with the Democrats and liberals favoring these more and giving them higher priority than the Republicans and conservatives for all five of these. Four of them, except the some students struggle or drop out of college because they don't enter with the college level skills. There was still a differential where more liberals thought so and were worried about that, but conservatives were also agreed with that. There wasn't as much difference between the two groups. So overall, when we look at these, we see that Californians do support diversity measures in public K-12 schools and also public colleges and universities by big amounts in most cases. But there are varied points of view, and it does differ by all sorts of things, right? But especially by ideology and partisanship, which is probably unsurprising, and of course also by race. So what are some closing comments you two have?
I just have a couple I want to share after looking at these results. I think that this merit myth really seems to kind of underlie some of the policy attitudes and beliefs. So whenever there's a policy or a question, it's kind of like, hey, if we gave more money and then that made everyone be able to try really hard, would you like that? People are like, yes. Like, let's give more money so that people can still do the work and try hard. Those seem to have high support. But whenever a policy is presented as something extra, right, or extra funding to make up, that's not quite as highly supported. So that was one of the issues. The second issue is it seemed like the funding for K through 12 across the board did have higher support with the participants in the survey than some of the higher education stuff. So perhaps residents or voters really feel like the K through 12 is the primary, and certainly this is in California been the case over many decades, where K through 12 is the major issue, right? The thing we need to fix. And then higher ed is kind of like, once we fix this, and we'll move on to higher ed Sunday. And then I kind of had a question that I maybe should pose to the group too for us to think about is, Democrats control California. They control the legislature. They control the governor. As Professor Nalder has mentioned many times, a lot of these policies are extremely popular with both liberals and Democrats. So what's going on, right? Why are we in this situation? And we are the majority in the state. The policies are very popular, and yet on some of these, we don't see maybe increased funding or increased movement. So it's, I guess, maybe an uncomfortable question, but it's just a question I maybe have for the group for us to possibly discuss is why they're very popular things. Why aren't we doing them?
Yeah, do people want to make comments on that? I've got a microphone for you.
I think it's mostly because people might not trust the system itself, where they want these things to happen, but they don't trust to put the money into these systems to do those things. It could also be worried that people could be worried about money financials here in California itself, because California is expensive. And even if maybe some people are worried about that coming out a lot of out of their pockets and it not going to the correct places that they want it to go. So, yeah, that's my comment.
So I was asked to think about, reflect on a question around, one, us being an MSI. So how does this sort of...
Can you say what that is?
Sure. A minority serving institution. So how many of you know that we're a minority serving institution?
What does that mean?
One person? Two? Now about two people? Okay. I just saw one hand. So a minority serving institution means we have two federal designations, right? We have the ANAPISI, Asian American Native Pacific Islander designation, and we also have an HSI designation. I'm more familiar with the HSI designation, which means that 25% of our undergraduate student enrollment is nothing students. And ANAPISI, I believe, is less than, I think it's 20%, but don't quote me on that one because I don't know that one for certain. At Sac State, 37% of our student population is identifies as Latinx. And so if we think about what does that mean, I would throw it back to us. So what does it mean to be a serving institution for this population? And so as we think about what are asset-based approaches, which would be, as Dr. Victor talked about, like some of those questions were individualistic. So if we think about the individuals, which are oftentimes deficit-based, and we have programs and policies that focus on the individual rather than thinking about how do we change the system to be more of an asset. Well, deficit approaches think about the student that you're in the wrong. Right? So I think about when I was on academic probation as a student. I was the one that was wrong. There was nothing that the institution was doing to help me go on academic probation. The institution didn't see anything wrong with that, right? Or have a policy on getting me out of academic probation. So I had a student yesterday who was in my office who's on academic probation, continued probation, has tried to get out of academic probation by getting her grades up. But the registrar has not fixed the grade. They're not averaging them correctly. So she continues to not get out of academic probation. There's nothing wrong with her grades. Like if you look as an individual on her grade system, there's nothing wrong. It's the institution that hasn't changed whatever glitches and fixes need to be changed over there. So I think this goes to that individual versus system-based approach. And I think we need to be thinking more about that. Like when we ask questions, are we asking questions about the individual or are we asking questions about the system? The other thing is when we think about asset versus deficit, a lot of times we think about the deficit bringing, there's something wrong with the individual versus seeing that as a wealth, an asset they bring to the classroom. and we don't change our curriculum to be based on those assets. So when we think about like the STEM disciplines, oh, math is math. Math isn't math. And science isn't science, right? Like we know that there are things that we can be doing in our community regarding, I think about, is it this boiled water? Oh, the water management system, and then this hurting a particular individual group.
Flint.
Yes, Flint, Michigan. Flint, Michigan. You got that right. But like when we think about like Flint, Michigan, we know that there were like environmental policies that could have been impacting that group that were for that particular area, geographic location, that particular community, that particular racial demographic. But we didn't see any resources.
It was an African-American community,
Right.
For people who don't know. Yeah.
People that don't know, yes. So, but we didn't see any resources being given to that particular community. If this was probably, I don't know, the white neighborhood right now. Connecticut, Kansas.
All of Connecticut.
Connecticut, Kansas, it might have looked a little differently. So I think that's what we also need to be thinking about.
Okay, there's an audience here. You guys have paid great attention. You must have some comments or some questions.
Thank you. I've been ruminating on the slide related to pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and the folks who have the least amount of education felt that that was a correct association, or that was maximally achievable. Given that this was in 2022, correct? Currently, we're seeing a huge decline in the number of people who were even seeking post-secondary degrees at community colleges and universities. And there were some recent articles that have looked at those demographics, in particular, the 18 to 30-year-old folks, and they are least likely to be interested in going to college. And some speculation has been that they don't feel a lot of pressure to need to do that because they are actually well employed at this point in time. And so I'm wondering if those people who answered the survey in that way are thinking, well, yeah, I'm doing fine the way I am. I don't need to get a higher education because I've been able to pull my bootstraps up and succeed without it.
Hello, my name is Abayomi. I had a question. I don't know if it's necessarily a question, but I'm fascinated with this idea of how do we actually get policy to support students of color, specifically naming Black students. I forgot the name of the legislation that we're trying to get passed to support, like, get more funding for specifically Black students. How do you think that can actually come in reality? Do we have to be race neutral when it comes to policy, or be more intentional of being like naming racial groups that are impacted in K-12 education?
I think one of the things that I think we need to be more intentional about is naming the policy. So I think we oftentimes talk globally, but I would challenge us to be more specific as to, like, well, what policy are there access? So my big one is, and Dr. Villajanti knows this, that the GRE is racist. We know that.
It's the graduate entrance exam for graduate school.
Totally an acronym person. Just call me out on it. Sorry. So, and I have been trying for years to get all of Sac State graduate programs to eliminate the GRE, the graduate records examination. And they won't. Why? They need a field trip.
A filter.
Exactly. They want to make their job easy. So if we think about, well, what other ways can we make your job easy? They want to just filter. They get 290 applications. Amber, I don't know how do I look through 290 applications? I need to just filter that out. So if we think about, okay, if that's the problem, then let's go after that problem. What are some other filters? What are some other ways we can help you filter whatever you're doing that without taking a racist exam? But I think you have to think about like what policy because that would open up access to it. Because we know that we don't have a lot of students of color in our graduate programs.
But I think
Especially the
back
ones that have the GRE.
back to Dr. Victor's point, though, in selling it to the electorate, it does seem that naming groups is disadvantageous, right? That we want to say this, we're helping folks who are Californians that need things, but we don't say who exactly, because that gets less approval. Just if you're being strategic, that would make more sense if you wanted to win.
The other thing you have to think about is what is in their best interest too. So if you think about Derek Bell's interest convergence, and if I have a spin that, oh, well, you do this, it advantageous your group. So I'm gonna take your way.
Other comments and questions, and then what else do you have in the audience? All right. Oh, we do have some.
I just had a question about the unpreparedness going in from high school to college. Isn't California nationally ranked pretty high in terms of education? So why do so many people think that they're unprepared when it comes to college?
So we used to have higher test scores than other states, but since Prop 13 passed many decades ago now, the funding has been decreased to California K-12 public schools, and our test scores have not been as good since then. Does anybody have anything else to add? I mean, we're not Mississippi, but yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much. A little note before we go. This is being recorded, as you can see, and so we'll be posting this event on the websites for the Center for California Studies and the Project for an Informed Electorate as soon as it's made, which will be soon. And we want to thank Sandra Bernard, who's done a ton of work to put this together, and Leonore Elling, who has also done a bunch of work on this project. She's the one who got the grant in the first place and organized the whole group. And Kristina here Professor Victor, also did a bunch of work on the poll itself. So I wanted to make sure that we're all aware of that. And so thank you to everyone for coming, and thank you to the people that helped make it happen.